Hi, my name is Malgorzata Iwaniec Thompson. I'm one of the research associates at Sheffield University. And today I would like to talk to you about our recent project. In our recent project, we've done a mixed method study, and we've investigated science reporting of retracted articles. And we focus on two areas. So first, we focus on content analysis, where we've looked at online articles based on the retracted papers. So we focused on 100 articles, online news stories, and they were based on 22 retracted articles that gained the most attention online in August 2024. And so we've investigated how those 100 articles, based on those 22 retracted articles, how the story is framed. So that was one part. The second part is we've done interviews with journalists in the UK and Finland. Okay, so first of all, I'll describe to you some of the findings that we got from the content analysis. So in general, actually, based on those 100 articles, there was a dominance of blogs and independent media, which implies that actually what we see about or the stories that are present are mainly from the blogs rather than mainstream media. And if there were, there were some stories that were published by mainstream media, and there were mainly outlets like BBC, Reuters and Forbes in the UK. But those stories mainly consider retracted articles that were of high profile. So we had topics like COVID, gender identity, or new physics claims. And in those stories, we've noted like this dual pattern in media narrative. So on one hand, we had stories that were more about kind of just informing the audience that was the retraction, and then those are the reasons why the story was retracted. But it was mainly about this kind of journalistic impartiality here. So it was kind of simply that's sort of what happened. On the other hand, we had a lot of stories, which were mainly actually in blog and independent media, which were more sensationalized. So they were more kind of charged with kind of this sensational language. There were some, conspiracy theories and that kind of things. What we also found interesting is, even though if you look at, for example, Retraction Watch database, they have a long list of why a retracted article can be retracted. But when we looked at the stories, the reasons why these retractions happened was mainly actually highlighting the fact that there was some issues with the data. So, the questions about data integrity and fraud. If there were some stories, and there were some singular kind of stories about kind of the challenges around academic publishing in general, those would be single stories. So for example, there was a story of a lady whose paper was withdrawn, but it was just one story rather than actually highlighting the problem that we have now, which is about this pressure on academics to publish a lot. So this idea of publish or perish, and then so far, when I've read the stories, none of the articles actually focused on a bigger issue of there is a problem in academic writing. So on the whole, there was not a lot of information around the reasons why the retraction occur, and often it was almost like a copy of what the retraction notice was all about in the story, rather than something more. So it almost like the readers who are reading that would also have to unpick actually what it meant, why the story was retracted. So I think something there really needs to be changed in how the stories are framed. All right. The second stage of our study focused on discussions with journalists. That was in the UK and Finland. So in general, there was this universal kind of absence of systematic monitoring process for scientific retractions. So that was both in the UK and Finland. So it very much kind of rely on happenstance or on a big story, high-profile case scandals. Or also there was this element of informal network. So if there was a big story and the journalist would know someone who, heard about this story, that's kind of how it would be reported on. So in general, it was this professional ambivalence towards transparency. So journalists value correction as a principle, but they find it actually institutionally disincentivized in looking at those stories. So, they all talked about, yes, it would be great to report on stories like that, but actually we don't hear about those stories. And then therefore following up on stories that they've already written, it was also challenging because, very often a journalist, once they write a story, that's it, they don't go back to the story. And then so, putting a notification on the story that they've already written, no one probably would read that story anyway, so there is not much of an incentive to actually go back to the stories. Another thing is, especially actually for freelance journalists, there is no financial incentive to go back to the story. If they already written something and then only part of the sources that they've used is retracted, probably they're not going to, get the story being published again, but also no one is going to actually read that story. So, and writing a completely new story costs money. So if especially they are freelancers, they wouldn't be doing that. Even though they do say that, it would be important to actually do it, but there is just no incentive there. Something else that it did come up that it was interesting, it was, and that was different in the UK and in Finland. In the UK, there was this, the trust surfaced as a recurrent theme in the interviews. So that was both trust in scientific sources, but also trust in journalism in itself. So interviewees spoke of the dual erosion, so declining of public confidence in science, but also, growing skepticism towards media in general. Whereas in Finland, Finnish journalists, they largely believe that trust in science and journalists remains really high. They did talk about social media, but they kind of suggested that had not significant impact or influence on their reporting, which I think is really interesting because then, those contexts where the stories or where the journalists are is really important. Okay, so when it comes to accessing the news and information, journalists talked about moving away from university press releases. So they were talking about kind of getting hold of the original source, so they can do the, reading and kind of digesting of what the article is about before they write something in the article. But at the same time, very often they wouldn't have a lot of time. So there was this reliance on expert networks at the same time as kind of reliance on their expertise. So again, it was different when I was talking to strictly kind of science journalists because they would have that background with them, writing about kind of similar stories, so they'll feel more comfortable. They'll have bigger networks to rely on, to check, to verify the information. And then and others actually also talked about social media as kind of quality control. So if there was a lot of buzz about, certain topic, they would take that more into consideration. They might even be more skeptical about a particular topic. While there were not necessarily a kind of a recent change, there was a lot of conversation about time constraints, which fundamentally kind of shaped the access process as well. So that was actually contrasting again with what they were saying, how much work actually goes into checking each of the story. So it all kind of depends on how much time they have per story and how long the story needs to be as well. Something that they did discuss as well was the academics. So on one hand, they talked about that, they, again, through their networks, they will have academics who can talk to them, and then they can, give them quotes and so on. But actually now it's even more and more difficult to get hold of the academics, because the university sometimes can put a sort of barrier in between before they talk to the journalists. But at the same time, they also talked about academics being actually more inclined to talk to journalists, because there is more of a push now for academics to kind of almost open up the way how they work and how they get data, and translating the difficult kind of jargon into something that is more digestible for the public, for the wider public. So when it comes to the gatekeepers for kind of this public knowledge, the journalists talked about, they still talk about this kind of science elite of traditional gatekeepers. So they did highlight that, if they see a story in a top tier peer-reviewed journal like Nature, Science or Lancet, so those big journals are still, they create that trust that, if something is probably published there, that is more trustworthy. So sometimes, almost the guard of checking in more detail what the story is not as robust as, if the story comes from a different journal. Again, they talked a lot about networks and relationships with scientists, and the recommendations as well. So, very often if they don't know someone in a particular field, they will ask their networks, do you know someone who is in that particular field who could, give me a quote or comment or even check whether that story makes sense. A lot of the journalists also talked about, at least in the UK, about this Science Media Centre. So this is an organization that identifies as like a powerful kind of real-time peer review layer. Especially that was important for the stories when the journalists didn't have as much time to do the verification themselves or get hold of the quote themselves. Because so the Science Media Centre, what it does is when they take it, when there is a new story, they try to do that as much as they can, and they have the kind of the resources available if the journalist wants to use that. Okay, when it comes to impact of online platforms, there was definitely a lot of conversations about, this disparity in what is expected of those of writers for those two different sometimes places. So journalists talked about codes of conduct and what they have to do for the story to be published, and they were very much disheartened when you see a story somewhere in social media and they don't have that background, and sometimes that story is it seemed to be like it's a more important story, or it gets more attention. What they've also talked about is this issue of how that there is this erosion of quality. So because there are so many different stories, and they described it as a huge sea filled with very unpleasant debris everywhere. And so for the reader, because there are so many different stories which are inaccurate, which are factually wrong, but because there are so many stories around people like that, it almost is difficult to actually go through with the story that is factually correct and is robustly done. So what the journalist talked about is that social media created that narrative that my story is my truth, and so it's difficult then to kind of encourage people to read something that perhaps might be slightly different to what they already believe. Okay, so there were some really interesting stories, example of stories that the journalist talked about. So, for example, some of the stories that were misleading or that were problematic was there was this genomic project where the purpose of the project actually was very much misunderstood. So the purpose of the project was to kind of focus on stopping hereditary disease, but the media made it more about one part of the project, which was the ability to pick the gender of an embryo. And there was just a flood of lots of information and lots of noise that was not the focus of the story. There were a lot of conversations or a lot of examples around COVID as well. So journalists were constantly inundated with information, requiring a quick triage to distinguish between what was kind of robust and inaccurate around, say, factual errors. And because of the challenges of how this information was changing very quickly, sometimes, what they said in a story could change the day after, or, the story wasn't correct in the first place because, the information they got was wrong. So there were lots of examples where, again, the journalist felt like this was a tricky time for them to maintain that trust with the audience. And that also kind of linked with other stories which were all about Andrew Wakefield and MMR, where his story was retracted. But because some of the journalists kind of covered the story from the beginning, by the time it was retracted, they've already written something. And then when the story was retracted and the journalists kind of change or altered what they've written, then they would get a backlash from the audience saying, well, hang on a second, you said that, a few weeks ago that was a good story. Why are you changing? And so lots of conspiracy, theories, well, you're changing because, someone is telling you to change. And so it was difficult to kind of navigate that, that evolution of a story. So if there were a lot of stories about a particular subject that just created a lot of noise and a lot of clicks, what journalists talked about is sometimes they would get a nudge from the editor and almost a complaint, well, why didn't you cover that story? But very often the journalists talked about, well, I don't necessarily think this is the right story to cover. So sometimes there might be this push from the editor saying, you should cover this story because everyone else is talking about this story. While the journalists are actually thinking, well, but this story is not perhaps robust story. And sometimes it did happen that actually the story then was retracted or was something wrong. So, that dynamic of let's just write a story because it's going to be clickable versus, well, hang on a sec, let's just see where the story is going to be. But there were also, some highly suspicious kind of research story, which again, there was one breakthrough, for example, in South Korea, when they're talking about superconductivity, that received a lot of noise, that received a lot of newsroom kind of chatter. But the journalist who talked about this story, he said, well, I was a bit hesitant about what, whether I should report it. And he didn't report it. And it turns out that the story was completely flawed. So in general, when the journalists do approach a story, they talked about this internal scrutiny and kind of vetting before the publication. So, they very much rely on internal judgment, consulting with their contacts, reviewing methodology. So therefore, a background of kind of understanding of methodology is really important, that they've talked about as well, and the ability to filter out low quality studies. When it comes to the post-publication corrections, that was very much a non-systematic. So no journalist reported having a systematic process for checking for retractions. And that was due mainly to the, the way how the news kind of are set up. So the news work, the pressure to moving on to the next story, but also the fact that retractions sometimes can take a really long time. So, the story is gone. There is no point in coming back to the story. If there was a retraction that was found, which actually none of the journalists did talk about that experience themselves, that something that they've written was then completely changed, unless it was like the story around MMR. They saw that more as an evolution of stories rather than completely changing something that they've written in the past. But if there was a story like that, they've talked about it, that they would flag it up with their editors. They would ask for either be taking the story completely of the server, of the data, or completely taking the story down, or they will ask to add some sort of notification that this paper was retracted, or they'll completely taken out, or they will edit the story with the paper that was retracted, just completely taking that out. But in general, the editorial values are not really aligned with the kind of public interest in revisiting the old story. So when it comes to the hopes and the worries, there were some positives. I think I'll start with the positives. So the journalist felt like there is a lot of technological support for accuracy. So for example, things like SMC, there is definitely, they feel like is this increased professionalism in training for journalists. So they talked about, for example, training, how to understand qualitative papers, quantitative papers, some understanding on the statistics, that there is more and more of that, and they would like to see even more of this as well. They also highlighted this increased scientific engagement. So if there are stories that are not correct, very often this is going to be kind of mentioned by either public or the networks in general. And they talked about also this improved ethics and codes of conduct, that journalists are really trying very hard to make sure that what they write, it makes sense and is true. When it comes to worries, it was more about that science sometimes can become a highly contested area, and it can lose the public trust because of the amount of information, factually wrong information that is available, and the misinformation and platform influence as well. There is lots of platforms that just have conspiracy theories and things like that, so that really doesn't help. The last thing I wanted to mention when it comes to worries is the push for academics to publish something very quickly, and this idea of publish or perish, where unfortunately some academics, some scientists might be taking a shortcut because they want to publish something, because that means being able to stay at the university or get promotion, or there are also like predatory journals and so on. So that is a worrying, that for a journalist then to recognize that this journal, for example, doesn't even exist, or why this academic actually would do something that is wrong. This is a challenge. That is a worry that they're thinking about.